Thank you all for joining us for the Market Assessment and Customer Discovery Workshop. Joining us today is Leith Martin, Executive Director, Troesh Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation. He's going to discuss how to gain customer feedback about whether your service or product has value and discuss product market fit and customer discovery. I'm going to hand it over to him to get us started.
Cool, thanks again. So thanks everyone who came, and listen, the way this screen is set up, just to let you know, we can't see you. So if you have something specific that you want to say, just interrupt me at any point. You can throw it in the chat if necessary, and Ege can keep up with that as well. But just if you have any questions, please interrupt me. That's my most important message. So just ask questions as they come about. Because I'm one workshop of many workshops that you participate in, I'm going to make some assumptions. So I'm going to make an assumption that at this point, there's probably been someone talking about maybe something like a business model canvas or something like that that will help you organize your idea. What I'm specifically going to talk about, as Ege mentioned, was, how do you figure out, or what's the process, or one of the processes that you use to help figure out whether or not your idea is commercially viable. One of the most important things that you need to do is you need to figure out what your customers want. Now, that sounds pretty intuitive, and it's something that sounds somewhat obvious, but the truth is oftentimes there's things that you know and there's things that you don't know, and until you go out and ask, you have to go find out that specifically what customers want. The other thing that's important to realize is I had a strategy professor one time in graduate school, and he made a comment that stuck with me, and he said, always be careful of a market survey consisting of a sampling size of one. Right? The gist of that is that just because you want it doesn't mean millions of other people want it. And because it's your idea, oftentimes you drink your own Kool-Aid and you convince yourself that you're right, and the reality is you may or may not be right. So be very, very careful in the way that you assume that everyone operates in the same way that you do. All right, so let's talk about customer discovery. Now, the first thing we'll talk about is specifically pre-planning and what you should do. Now, the first thing I put on here is find 100 names. And do you need to find 100 names? Maybe, maybe not. But my point is you're going to have to do lots of interviews. The reality is that this isn't something that you go interview 4 or 5 different people, and those 4 or 5 different people confirm your biases. Then you move forward, and the reality is you should build something that ultimately doesn't work. What you really want to do is you want to do enough interviews that you're confident that you've identified specifically who your customer is. And that sounds kind of intuitive, but the reality is the number of times I see businesses that I ask them or see people that are working on new ideas, and I said, who's your customer? And they'll say something like every American male. And the first thing is I normally say is there's a pretty good chance that that's not true. Every American male does not see the world the same way. They're not the same people. They don't act the same way. Their behaviors aren't the same way. But as entrepreneurs, what we like to do is we like to have big numbers. And the reason we like to have big numbers is then we can use small numbers to make our businesses work. We can say things like, if I just get 1/2 of 1% of a total market of half of the American males, which is 170 million people, then I have a business. Right? Well, the reality is that you can't market as a startup to 170 million people. You're always scarce in people. You're always scarce in resources. So in the beginning of your business, you better determine exactly who's most likely to adopt your product and service. And this customer discovery process allows you to do that. And it's really the ones that are most likely to adopt your product or service in the earliest stage of your business. Does it mean that you can't expand outside that initial adoption of customers? No. But it does mean that you need to spend your money and your time, especially in the early days, as efficiently as possible to ensure the success of your business or your startup. So when I say find 100 names, the other thing is that you're probably, if this is a real business that you're going to start, you need to probably think about doing 100 interviews to determine whether or not your business is viable or not. And some people say, wow, 100 interviews is a lot of interviews. Do I really have to do that many? Well, there's 2 ways to look at this. You can either do 100 interviews or somewhere around 100 interviews to ensure that you've identified the right customer and your business will work, or you can dive headlong into the opportunity and 3 years later, having spent a lot of your time and all of your money, realize that the business was destined to fail in the beginning because you didn't have a customer. So spending an extra couple months making sure that you've identified your initial customer base is more important, in my opinion, and worth the effort to ensure that you know exactly who those people are. The other reason is that I recommend that maybe 100 interviews is kind of a magic number, is because in the very beginning of this customer discovery process, there's one thing that I can guarantee is true. You're probably not very good at doing customer discovery interviews. And the first 15 or 20 are, quite frankly, not very valuable. You're going to ask the wrong questions. You're going to ask the wrong people. You're not going to be, maybe you're nervous. Maybe you roll headlong into a demo. We'll talk about why that's not the right choice. But there's going to be lots of things that you're not going to do correctly. So the first 15 or 20 interviews are throwaway interviews. The next 20 or 30, maybe you're approaching 50 interviews, something like that, you're going to start to see patterns. You're going to figure out how your questions you should be asking, how you should be asking those questions, and you're going to start to recognize patterns. And then you're going to test those patterns over the next 20 or 30 interviews. And then the final 20 or 30, you're basically confirming what you think you've already heard. So find 100 names. The other thing is that you're going to have to realize that for every 10 people that you reach out to, 9 are probably not going to reply. And so, you're going to start with 100 names, and you're probably going to end up with 15 or 20 interviews max. And so you're going to have a lot of people that you have to interact with during this process to ensure that you know exactly who your customer is. So how do you do that? Obviously, use social media is incredibly important. LinkedIn is incredibly important. Those are factors that can significantly decrease the amount of time necessary in order to identify potential customers. Why? Because lots of people on social media already follow people or organizations that are relevant to who you're trying to meet. They've already classified themselves as dog lovers because they're members of the English Bulldog Club on social media. So now that you know they like dogs, they might, because if you're selling a product to someone who's a pet owner, maybe that's a way to identify those potential customers. We've already taken ourselves and put ourselves in buckets on social media, and that allows us to help filter through people that could be potential customers in a more effective way. So if you're a business to business, in other words, you're selling your product or service to a business, your customer discovery will look very different than maybe a business to consumer. A business to consumer might be literally walking around the mall or trying to find people that are willing to talk to you that you can do customer discovery with. A business customer, you may have to set an appointment. You may have to walk in cold. No one replies and try to schedule a meeting with someone. It's a very different type of relationship in terms of the way that you build those customers or those customer discovery interviews. The next thing you need to try to do is you start in the middle of an organization if it's a business to business client. And the reason I say that is because oftentimes what we like to do is talk to the CEO. Like, I want to talk to the boss. They're the one that knows. But the truth is, if you're building a software platform that helps them manage inventory more efficiently, the CEO doesn't freaking know how they manage the inventory. He just knows how the business is run generally, who he needs to fire and hire in his C-suite. Maybe he knows who his key customers are, but he probably doesn't know what they use in terms of the warehouse tools. So you need to start with the people that actually have the problem and the people that will use your product or service. And the other reality is you only get one shot at the top. Right? And so if you blow your one shot at the top in customer discovery, you don't get to go back later and say, hey, we found product market fit. We need to talk to you about the possibility of using our product or service in the future. So talk to the people that use your product or service. Don't talk necessarily to the people that are quote unquote in charge, because oftentimes those people aren't necessarily the people that face the problems that you're ultimately trying to solve on a day-to-day basis. All right, next, customer discovery should be face-to-face. Now, pre-pandemic, I would have told you that every interview should be face-to-face. Now, everyone's more accustomed to using video conferencing, so maybe video conferencing is okay. I'll also tell you that it's not ideal. There are lots of nonverbal reactions that people have that you pick up when you talk to people in person that you do not see in video. 100% don't see in telephone, and you never get on a survey online. Right? So face-to-face data, especially in the early stage of your idea, is incredibly important. Whether or not you know it or not, we're people, we interact with other people, we intuitively pick up signals that they have, whether they don't really like it, whether or not they don't necessarily agree with you. Those are the things that you need to be observing, and you need to be able to see people in order to do that. We've all been on a conference call in a room like this, and the conference room phone is oftentimes here in the middle. And there's a group of people here, there's a group of people somewhere else in the world, and we're on the phone, and what happens? someone on the other end says something, everyone in this room looks at each other like freaking idiot. And then somebody just pushes the button and said, yeah, sounds good to us, right? So my point is, you cannot pick up what people really think if you only hear their voice, because we're very good at masking the way we really feel about ideas or solutions. And so we have to be really careful in the way that we do customer discovery interviews and understand that face-to-face data is the best data. All right, next, create your list of questions. Sounds pretty intuitive. Lots of groups that I work with, they're nervous about doing interviews. They haven't done these interviews before. They're not sure how it's going to go. Maybe they're socially awkward. Maybe they're an introvert. Maybe they're not comfortable. So if you create your list of questions going in, you don't end up going down all these side paths. The other thing is, when we're nervous, we talk more. And whether or not we believe it or not, that's what happens. Especially when we're talking about something that we like or our idea, because then we go into sales mode. And then we talk the whole time. And then after a 30-minute interview, we're like, well, I talked 27 minutes. I didn't get anything out of this interview. So if you create your list of questions, then you're more focused in moving down the list of questions on the things that you want to figure out. And also, not only does it keep you focused, it allows you to start altering your questions based on the effectiveness of those questions during the process. And then finally, you need to set up those interviews. And there's something odd about walking into a business and saying, can I talk to someone about something? Why? Because then instantly, whoever you're talking to is in anti-sales mode, which is really a bizarre phenomenon we have as people. We always feel like we don't want to be sold, but yet we buy stuff all the time, but we don't want to be sold. And so we instantly put up this wall and we don't want to have those conversations. When in reality, maybe you feel like it's a waste of our time, whatever it may be. But oftentimes, if you set up the interview in advance, you're much more likely to get a more effective interview. If you are associated with a university, it makes it a lot easier, because for some reason, if I walk into a business and say, hey, can I talk to you? Can I interview someone, whoever uses your point of sale software? They're going to be like, even if that's the person that uses the point of sale software, they're oftentimes going to say, yeah, we don't have anybody here that does that, because they don't want to talk to you right now. But if you say, look, I'm a student working on a project associated with the university, can you give me 15 minutes of your time? They're like, okay, here is the passwords to the database. And something changes in that relationship, and they're now, all of a sudden, they're willing to provide information that they aren't willing to provide under normal circumstances. The other thing is that, you should set up interviews and schedule them in such a way that maybe you ask for 15 or 20 minutes. The truth is that no one's calendar goes to 15 or 20 minutes. They go for at least 30 minutes. And the reality is, as long as they don't feel like you're wasting your time, you're going to get 30. And if it's a meaningful conversation that both of you are having, they're probably going to give you an hour. Right? If you go ask someone, I need an hour and a half for an interview, zero chance, right? So you have to be careful in the way that you structure even your ask to set up your interviews. All right. So
It's kind of far, maybe.
oh, maybe it is. Actually, you probably can just use that. There you go. Perfect. Next. I'm actually gonna give that to you just in case you can like yourself. The next thing you need to do is you need to talk to strangers. And obviously that's a play on word. When we were little kids, we were told we should talk to strangers. But the reality is that these kind of interviews are not interviews that you do with your friends or your family. And the reason is because friends and family lie. They don't lie because they're attempting to mislead you. They lie because they're being supportive. And you don't need somebody to be supportive. You need someone to be honest. And strangers who are not invested in your emotional well-being are more likely to be honest with you. They're more likely to say, yeah, I think this is a dumb idea. I don't really think I would ever do that, right? Whereas your family might be like, yeah, you're working hard, keep trying, it'll work out, those kind of things. Those are things that you do not need to hear, all right? And so talking to strangers is incredibly important. You may want to do some interviews initially with friends or people that you know, because it allows you to get maybe more comfortable with the process. But in terms of valuable data, it has no value. So do not assume that because your parents or your siblings or your uncles or your cousin or everyone else says, yeah, this is great, then it is great. You better get out and talk to people that don't care about your feelings, because those are the people that ultimately will probably be your customers. All right, so ask for 15 minutes, settle for 45. That goes back to my comment before. Set the expectation relatively low in terms of the time commitment. Oftentimes, if you're not wasting someone's time, they probably booked a little time on the back end, and you might get a little extra time as well. If you tell someone I need an hour of your time, you're probably not gonna get it. Be honest with yourself and listen and don't talk. Now, as I mentioned before, when we're nervous, we talk. Whether we know we do or not, even the most introverted person, when they've scheduled the interview and they feel like they're leading the interview, they'll talk a lot. So you have to be careful. You have to listen. If you're not listening, then you're not learning. And what you want those individuals to do is to tell you about their day, the problems they have, the issues they have specifically, and whether or not your solution might solve those problems. Those are the conversations that you have to get access to. If you're talking, you're not getting access to those problems. And then finally, groups or associations. So as I mentioned before, social media is a great place. LinkedIn is a great place, but also we live in Vegas. And every week there is some association here or some convention here. And those associations or conventions are here to talk to people and do business. And so you can go to, you develop a new polymer that allows you to, that is a fire retardant. Well, you can go to the National Chemical Association, making it up, that'll take place in Vegas sometime this year. And over the course of 3 days, you can do hundreds of interviews. And so leverage the fact that you live here to do those type of customer discovery activities, but also identify associations or groups that actually have people that already have self-identified as those kind of people that potentially could be your customers, and leverage those to find people that you need to do interviews with as well. All right, any questions? Okay, cool. All right, so how do you make contact with these people, right? The first thing is lots of times you're not going to know someone in advance, so you're going to have to do a cold call. But you can do your research ahead of time. For example, this is just a sales technique. This isn't necessarily unique to customer discovery. It can be just a sales technique. Let's say, for example, that you are want to reach out to someone, and it turns out that your uncle and the person that you're trying to connect to both went to school at UNC Chapel Hill. Great. Include that information in your intro email. First of all, welcome.
Daniel, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, Daniel. So if you can find some sort of connection to them, it makes it much more likely that they're going to talk to you. Maybe they went to UNLV too. Maybe they got a degree in the same thing you got a degree in. Leverage some sort of connection to them, because general human nature makes it more likely that they're willing to talk to you. Next, email, then call, then email. I put multiple touches, multiple modalities. People in the business world will typically reward persistence. Right? Now, I'm not suggesting you be a stalker, right? But what I am suggesting is that if you're consistent and respectful in reaching out, it increases the likelihood that they're gonna make the effort and meet with you. The first email might not work. We all get those emails. Hey, we don't know for sure if it's a blast email, if it's a targeted email specifically. If we know that we've made that connection, as I mentioned before, it increases the likelihood that the reader's going to identify that email as not a mass email, and increase the likelihood they're willing to talk. The other thing is I'll use a specific example. I had posted an ad for a position in one of my companies one time, and I wasn't really sure if I was going to hire someone. I thought I would, but I wasn't sure. I wasn't convinced myself that I was going to do it. And so I had interviewed a few people, but I didn't move forward. But there was one gentleman that reached out to me the following week, and he said, "Hey, Leith, what's the story you're going to hire for this position? You know, I'd love to. I'm definitely interested." And I was like, his name was Charles. I said, "Charles, I'm not really sure." I said, "I'm interviewing a few more candidates." And he said, "Well, what if I reach out? When's a good time to reach out?" And I was like, "I don't know, give me a week." And he says, "Great, what time would be good?" Gave him a time. Called me back a week later on exactly that time. Once again, not convinced I was going to hire for the role. Wasn't sure what the economy was going to do. Same question. When can I call you back? Give me 2 weeks. Great. What time? 2 weeks later, he calls back at exactly the time. The next day, I talked to my business partner after that third or fourth call, and I said, "We have to give this guy the job. I mean, I mean, he's done everything I've asked him to do, when I've asked him to do it. He's persistently reached out to me. Every time I've told him to reach out to me, we have to give him the job. The guy worked for me almost 15 years, right? And so in general, people in the business world will reward persistence. If you are persistent and you show some sort of initiative, they will generally reward that. I've seen students or I've seen other people that I've worked with on projects who need to meet with someone in the medical profession that can't get an appointment with a physician, that will go to the hospital and walk from their car to the door through the parking garage for 5 minutes of their time. And if they do that once or twice, that person will probably schedule a few minutes with them, right? And so persistence will be rewarded. And if you think those things are hard, do not start a company, because these are the easy parts of starting a company, right? These are the learning about whether or not it's viable. So persistence will be rewarded in general in the business community. All right. So network or get a warm intro. If you know someone that knows someone that you're trying to connect, obviously get an introduction. Dramatically increases the likelihood they will schedule a meeting with you. If they know someone that you know and that person by proxy will vouch for you, then it dramatically increases the likelihood they're going to connect and spend some time with you. All right, so I put on here target the number 2 rate companies. And let me tell you why. This is from personal experience. I was starting, one of the companies I started, we had this network appliance that did lots of things for businesses. But one of the services we provided is failover service. So if you lost your primary internet connection, this box that sat in your back room would automatically connect you to a backup connection. And one of those alternatives was an LTE or 4G connection. So let's say you're running a retail store, you lose your connection, you have to put a sign on your door that says, sorry, credit card machine down because I can't process credit cards. Our device would automatically connect you to the LTE network. You would never go down, and you didn't have to put that sign up because that was the death knell. No one came in your store because no one had cash anymore. And so we were trying to figure out who was going to be our LTE provider, our 4G provider for our platform. And so we had a Linux-based operating system on our equipment, and I sent one of my techs. At the time, there were 4 big providers in the U.S. So Sprint, T-Mobile, AT&T, and Verizon. So I sent my technician out to all their retail stores. At the time, many of them had retail stores, and said, go in and take the USB dongle from every one of them, plug it into your laptop, which ran the same version of Linux that we ran on our system. And if it works, great, that's going to be our provider, because we don't have to do driver support. We don't have to do anything interesting to try to make the tech work. It just works out of the box. So he walked into those 4 stores, and they came back to me and he said, okay, T-Mobile and AT&T. Out of the box, the equipment works. We don't have to do anything special. We can plug in their SIM card into our SIM card slot. Inside, we can use our antenna. Everything will work. I said, great. So I reached out to AT&T at the time, who was the largest provider in the country at the time. And AT&T's response to me was, well, listen, this is the way it works. If you want to connect appliances or equipment to our platform or network, you have to go through an approval process. And that approval process typically takes somewhere between 6 months and a year, usually costs about $75,000. And you have to send your equipment to our lab in San Francisco. During the week that we're testing your equipment, you need to send a technician there so that we can answer any questions that they may have. And also, well, that's the way our process works. And I said, well, let's talk about pricing. What I'd like to do, because we were using this service as a failover, right? Like we hoped we never turned it on, but if they lost their internet connection, then we used it. So my thing was I'd like to pay a low monthly fee per device for access. And then I want to pool the data across thousands of devices and only use it on the machines that I need it for. I don't want a certain amount assigned to each device so that then as I fail over, I go over my usage for this device, then I have to pay all these overage charges. And they were like, yeah, we don't really do that. We won't let you do that. And I was like, okay. So I called T-Mobile, and T-Mobile and AT&T at the time was the largest provider in the United States. T-Mobile was 4th. They were the smallest. Just invested a ton of money in their network. So I called the T-Mobile sales guy and I said, look, this is what I want to do. And he's like, cool. How many do you want? Where do you want me to send them? And how soon do you want me to activate? And that was the conversation. And my point is because they were number 4 in the country, they were aggressive. They were hungry. They wanted new customers. They weren't number one. They didn't have to be, they weren't selective. And so because of that, I was able to get access to them in a way that I couldn't get access to anyone else. So if you're trying to do customer discovery, if the culture of the organization that you're talking to is they're the industry leader, sometimes it's important that you meet with them. But the reality is their culture may be such that it's hard to get contacts with them. So find organizations or companies that are hungry. Those are the people that will talk to you, let you know what's going on in the industry. All right, so expect a low hit rate. 1 in 10 are going to reply. You reach out to 10 people, maybe one's going to reply. If you connect your university connection to the project or something, it might increase that number. If you also find people that will introduce you, it'll dramatically increase that number. If you also find connections to your potential interviewees, it'll dramatically increase that number. But a completely cold email, 1 in 10 will apply if you're lucky. All right. Any questions? All right. Cool. So how do you do the interview? This sounds pretty intuitive, but I cover it all the time in my classes as well, because I think it's important, because it's often pretty easy to sometimes lose track of a guide. So first of all, you should introduce yourself. Sounds reasonable, but introduce yourself. And specifically, if you're affiliated or you're working on a project affiliated with the university, leverage that because it opens people up. Next, have a 2-sentence description of your purpose. Now, I'm going to say this again, and we'll talk about why. This is not a demo, okay? This is not you walking in and saying, here is my cool widget, tell me what you think. This is not what the purpose of this interview is. This is an interview to help figure out the problems that they have that you might be solving with your solution, okay? So when you start the interview, you might say something like, my name is Leith Martin. I'm a student at UNLV in the College of Engineering. I'm working on a project specifically designed around, let's use this, the President's Innovation Challenge. And I'm trying to figure out what the market conditions are that might be suitable for my solution. That's all you say. Because if you say, I'm working on a aquaponics system that can be used inside the casino, you're over, right? It's over. Because then all you're going to do is talk about your specific solution in this particular instance. So you won't be able to talk about the problems that they experience or the other things. You're only going to talk about your solution. And you need to figure out whether or not your solution fits their problem without biasing them with the potential solution initially. So you only want to use that initial introduction, and then you dive into your interviews. So tell the interviewee how useful their input will be and how important they are to you. Typical sales strategy, right? Suck up a little bit, more likely that you're going to get valuable information. Remember that you're the one that's trying to learn, not them. So you're not talking about your solution, especially in the very beginning. You need to ask open-ended questions like why, how, when, those kind of things. You might have to ask a few qualifying questions in the beginning, like if you're trying to sell something to a pet owner, a dog owner, you might say, do you own a dog? And they might say, no. Have you ever owned a dog? No. Appreciate your time, right? There's no reason to have that discussion anymore because they're not a potential customer. They don't even own a dog and have never owned a dog. So you might ask some yes or no questions in the beginning, but these questions are questions that are open-ended questions that allow them to talk about their experiences and increase the likelihood that you're going to uncover things that you haven't identified. And then finally, asking the right questions. I've got a list of questions at the very end we'll talk about, or I'll provide just to get you started. But asking the right questions are incredibly important. I'll use an example. There was a project that we were working on it was actually in class. It was a great project, actually. There's a company down in Boulder City that's an engineering firm, and they have 2 offices, one in Boulder City and one in Huntsville, Alabama. And you might say, why Huntsville, Alabama? Well, it turns out Huntsville is one of between the Department of Defense and NASA and other organizations, they have like the highest per capita number of PhDs in the country. Really relatively small town, but huge technical expertise. And so this company between these 2 offices did tons of work for the space program and DoD and other programs. But as part of one of the programs they had developed, they had developed this technology that ultimately, in the application we were talking to them about, allowed them to take, if you have a big 18-wheeler, so a big truck, if you have refrigerated goods inside the trailer, you have to keep them cold. right? And so the way that worked up until this point is you used fuel from the truck itself to run a generator, which turned a condenser and a compressor that ultimately allowed you to cool the product inside the truck. Yeah. In the trucking industry where margins are very, very thin, the less fuel you use, which is a direct variable cost, dramatically increases the profitability of the business because it all goes to the bottom line. So they had developed this technology that allowed them to take the condenser, the exhaust out of the exhaust stack, run it through this chemical process that allowed them to, believe it or not, turn this heat into cooling that allowed them to cool the actual trailer itself. Had prototypes built, had driven it all around Vegas, worked, kept the stuff cold, kept it frozen, worked right. What we were working on was trying to figure out what the commercial viability of the product was and how they should take it to market, right? So I had a group of students, this is pre-pandemic, that were working on this. So it turns out that everyone that makes these refrigerated trailers are in the Midwest. They're in places like Iowa or Nebraska or Oklahoma. And so because no one used video at the time, our only choice was to use phone. And so I had a group of students working on it, and they scheduled a meeting with this engineering supervisor at one of these manufacturing companies in the Midwest. And they've done a great job. They'd asked all these great interviews. And at the very end, he kept asking, he said, so what are you guys working on? They did a great job. They said, we promise we'll tell you what we're working on at the end. At the very end, they had finished their interviews. They said, look, this is what we're building. This is what we're testing, and we're trying to figure out how to take it to them. And he was like, look, if this is real, this will change the industry. Like, this is a complete game changer in transportation or the freight industry. At the end, one of the students asked the question, in terms of asking the right question. He said, is there anything that we should have asked you that we didn't ask? And the guy was like, I can't think of anything. 5 minutes later, he sent us an email. He's like, hey, I just thought of something. If you guys are still available, jump on the conference bridge. So we jump back on the conference bridge, and the guy says, I was sitting there thinking about your question. And one of the things that happens in the trucking industry is if you have a truck driver and they're within 100 miles of home, they're going home for the night, right? And so they were going to take their trailer to wherever they're going to deliver their goods. They're going to back it up to the dock. They're going to unhook the truck. They're going to drive home, and they're going to come back the next day when the trailers are fully unloaded to pick it up again. If the truck isn't connected to the trailer and there's no exhaust, isn't the stuff going to melt? Now, 100% he's right. The truth was that hadn't been considered. Why? Because the inventors weren't truckers. They didn't know what they didn't know, right? And so they hadn't even thought about that. Now, it turned out later, they put in an electric motor. You could plug in the electric motor to the dock. It would run when it wasn't connected, but now they had a solution. Whereas if they had launched the product without that service, then it would have been a disaster. Because everyone would have said, how can you not know that we need to be able to run it when it's not connected to the truck? Because this was a bunch of engineers driving around town on a piece of equipment that worked, and they thought it was great, right? So you need to ask the right questions to identify what's called the unknown unknowns, or the things that you don't know that you don't know. I encourage you to go find this video. There's a video online by during the Gulf War. I can't remember if it's the first or second Gulf War. There was you and I talked about this, didn't we? Yeah. So it was the second one. We determined it was the first or the second.
I think it's the second one.
There's a second one. So the second one was basically Donald Rumsfeld was the Secretary of Defense at the time, and he would come out. The war only lasted 9 or 10 days, so he would come out every day and say, "This is what's happened. This is what's going on." The idea or the premise of the war was that Saddam Hussein had access to weapons of mass destruction and could potentially use it on allies or on the United States in some way, and that was one of the big premises. There was a retaliation component, but that was one of the big premises. And so there were lots of questions they asked Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld. Hey, did they find weapons of mass destruction? Did they do this? Did they do that? And he made a comment. He said, there are things that we know that we know. Things that we know that we know. Basically, I would put that in something like, we know they have 10,000 tanks. There are things that we know that we don't know. We know they have fighter jets, but we don't know how many fighter jets they know. But because we know they have fighter jets, we can plan around that. Right? And then there are things that we don't know, or things that we didn't know it even existed that we never even considered was an option. And those are the things that are incredibly dangerous. At the time, it was kind of chuckled at in the press corps at the time. But that one quote's been shown now millions of times in business schools all over the world because it was incredibly insightful in the comment. And what you're trying to figure out as part of this process are the things that you haven't identified, that you haven't even thought about. That's what you have to figure out. Those are the things that will kill you if you haven't actually identified them. All right, so get as specific as possible in your interviews, okay? So you need to ask for examples. When was the last time this happened? How often does it happen? Or give you examples. So you need to know those kind of things to figure out how big of a problem you're attempting to solve. Avoid talking about your technology. We've already talked about that. Embrace for bad news. People are going to tell you this is dumb. They're going to tell you it's dumb. Now, it might be because it's dumb. It might be because they're not the customer. But if you do 100 interviews and you haven't found a customer, you're the problem and your idea is the problem, not the customer, okay? So embrace for bad news and be prepared to change based on that. Remember that you're trying to identify painkillers or gain creators, things that reduce pain for your customers so they're willing to provide money for that because you provide value and reduction of pain, or you're actually creating more gain or opportunity for them, which is increasing value because they can now get access to more gain. Is this a mosquito or a shark bite problem? Is it a minor inconvenience, meaning I put some lotion on it, I continue on with my life? Or is this, there are sharks in the water and I'm not going in the water, so my behavior has changed as a result of the value that you're providing? And if it's just a mosquito bite issue, more than likely, you are not going to be able to create a consistent long-term customer base because the value you create is too minor for them to change their behavior to use your product. If you create something that's significant in terms of value, or you're creating a significant reduction in pain or improvement in gains, increases the likelihood that they're willing to make that change in their behavior and use your product. Because keep in mind, your product didn't exist yesterday and they used something else, or they didn't need it. And today, you've got to make sure that it's significant enough that they're willing to use it. All right, next. So interview format, be this fox and listen with big ears. Do not run your mouth the whole time. Do not talk the whole time. You won't get the information that you need. All right, so here's a list of sample questions. These are really generic questions. Ege has a copy of this deck, and so if you want a copy, you can reach out to him. Obviously, this is being recorded as well, so you have a copy that way as well. But if you just want a copy of the deck, you can have a copy of the deck as well. My general comment about questions is open-ended, allows them to talk about their experiences, typically are not yes and no answers, and get directly to the point in the sense that you guide them to ultimately where you're trying to get. You don't want to leave it so open-ended that the reality is they end up talking the whole time and you don't get any information, but you want to ask specifically about their problems in such a way that they're focused on answering your questions in an open-ended manner so that you might identify things that you hadn't thought of. For example, the example I used with the refrigeration truck. If they hadn't asked the question, what should we have asked that we didn't ask, or what are the things that we're missing, then they might not have gotten that information, and that would have been disastrous for the company at launch. I think this is the last slide, so make sure, yeah. So that's how you do customer discovery. I want to add one other thing, and you can drop that slide if you want. And again, I'll send you this as well. In terms of markets, so this is a lot about customer discovery, but I want to talk a little bit about markets. There are two things that I want to bring to your attention about markets in general. One is in terms of market research, I probably should say that. If I'm developing a completely new and innovative product that does not exist in the world today, then my customer discovery is more like what we've been talking about. Identifying what those customers' needs are, or who you believe what those customers' needs are and confirming those, that's a very different conversation than I want to open a dry cleaners. I don't have to wonder if people need dry cleaners. Why? Because there are lots of dry cleaners. Right? The question is whether or not there's enough competition based on the key success factors that I need to open a new dry cleaner at this location. Right? So in other words, I'm sure there are key success factors in the dry cleaning business, which are things like, I won't drive more than 2 miles to one. I don't know what they are, but something like that, right? They don't tear up my clothes. Great. I've got a new dry cleaner, right? So the question is, based on people who get their clothes dry cleaned, is there enough of those people in this market without an existing dry cleaner? Or can I do something unique that creates an opportunity for me? That market research is very different than do people need the stuff that I'm trying to build, right? Now, as a student at UNLV, ironically, if you access the guest network, you can gain access to this as well. There's some databases that we have at UNLV that you can get access to that provide you tons of information about market research. And I'll send you a copy of this so you have this as well. You send it. These are free databases that you have access to. You should leverage those as much as possible in your opportunity. If you look at this list, this is from Patrick. I have Patrick come in to speak to every class I ever teach. He's the business librarian and can come in and do a 30-minute, 45-minute session on what do we have at the library that can help you determine if your idea is commercially viable. He comes in and does that every time. This is a great list of tools that you can use. It goes everything. He's got it broken down in a broader sense, investment information, which is kind of more general business. But then he also breaks it down based on private companies, general fact information, industry information on the back, market research specific information, consumer information. So if your customer is consumers and you identify them as a certain demographic, then you can actually search the consumer database for people that specifically meet that demographic in your specific zip code. And when I say people, I mean their names and their addresses. That's the level of information that's available at the library. And then finally, there's lots of other general information on this as well, because it's got other business information. But this is a great source of information as well. So first is, do I have a customer? Then it could be, where are those customers and how do I reach those customers? You can find out some of that information here. And then if it's a more conventional business, it's really more about the line, specifically around what are the demographic information in a specific region based on my customer profile, and are there enough of those that I can justify doing business at this location? All right, cool. That's customer discovery market research. Questions, if any? Benjamin, I got to give you props. I mean, the number of notes that you've taken, I don't think I've said that many things that are important, but I'm incredibly impressed. Incredibly impressed.
My memory is terrible.
I understand. Your note-taking skills are impressive. Let's put it that way.
We'll open this platform for any questions that you guys have, and anybody that joined us online, they can unmute themselves or just chat us, and then I'll be happy to read that to Mr. Leith.
I got one. I'll start it off. My business idea it's a product that's certainly not new. It's 2,000 years old. It's very common. But I discovered the problem by accident.
Okay.
I'm Christian, not hardcore about it, but I'm a believer. Anyway, and all I wanted was a basic, simple cross to hang on the wall of my home as a daily reminder as to what it's about.
Okay.
So I go online to look, and you can get them from Amazon or Etsy or eBay and that stuff. But just a basic, simple wood cross, about 12 inches by 8 inches. They were wanting like $25, $30, $40, and some were much more elaborate.
Sure.
They're crucifixes and they're carved on. I just want something real basic.
Sure.
Just a basic reminder. I was thinking, in my mind, what's it worth? I said, well, maybe $10 plus shipping.
Sure.
And I couldn't find it. I said, well, what if I produced them? And I'm not trying to make the next mind pill of sell 10 zillion, but I just want to make them available to people at a basic thing. So I explored it. And I know some woodworkers, and I talked to them. Look, you need some basic tools that you're going to have. Your wood's not going to be the right. You're going to have to get a rip saw, you're going to get a cut saw, a planer, and glue it together. So, bottom line, use a good quality wood like poplar.
Sure.
What does that cost? I look at Home Depot and stuff. Basic, chop it down. So just the tools. Bottom line, to create the business, I'm looking at probably about $2,000 in equipment. But then material costs, wood, glue.
And that's a variable cost based
Yeah.
on the number that you pay.
Yeah, wood, so I'm looking at maybe $2.10 per cross. I said, the big cost if I'm gonna try to sell these things, and I'm actually going to go two ways, both business to consumer, individuals who want one, and business to business. Business to business, I would sell them primarily other churches who would then and then I said, the reason why a church would want it is that, say,
It's a fundraiser.
all their call, what I call special service, we got a wedding, well, there is a cross for your wedding, or baptism, or confirmation, or.
Maybe a gift or something they give away.
Or, yeah, for that matter, the church comes on their parishioners. There's a way for the church to make money. Okay, so those are the angles. But, first of all, churches don't have much money. They're all pretty much living on a shoestring. They're barely getting by. And that's okay. That's just the nature of that world. I'm familiar with it. I'm a treasurer of diocese in the parish, so I see that. But still, there's an opportunity there.
Sure.
And so therefore, I like the idea of interviewing questions. I go around and interview lots of different parishes and talk to them, and not necessarily the priest in charge, but talk to the people who administratively run the church and all that at this reward. But that part now, could I do it myself? I could. I really haven't got time for that. So I thought, well, this is a way to help maybe a church they tend to have a lot of parishioners who are willing to volunteer some time to help. But we're not talking high-tech construction, we're talking basic woodworking stuff, right?
Let them leverage their free labor.
So to speak, to help raise revenues for the church. So that's the idea. And then I simply help package it for them, and I would then take a small commission on it, like 5%, whatever they sell. And then I'm not a great person at social media advertising, but they tend to have young people who are. So get the word out, so to speak, and get it out there. But my question is this really viable? My intent of selling them is to sell them for less than $10, for like $7, $8 a piece. Okay, and therefore then churches again, they sound like well, here's $1,000. They haven't got $1,000. Should I sell them on consignment? And then.
Well, listen, I think in your particular case, the reality is that there is no people buy crosses. Lots of different types of crosses.
Right.
And so there's not an idea. It's not whether or not it's viable in the sense that people want them. They do want them, or they wouldn't buy them, right? The question is whether they want yours. And then more specifically, what's my distribution channel look like in order to get them in the marketplace? And I think the reality is because your upfront costs are relatively low, and you do have a volunteer component or a charitable component to the platform that I don't think you can necessarily go wrong. You just try two or three different ways, and you figure out which ways work best. Because the truth is that maybe it is a church that volunteers to use it as a fundraiser specifically for them. Great. That's a pathway to market. Maybe it is Benjamin in his garage putting together these things initially and putting it on Etsy and selling a few of them to see if there's market penetration or some adoption.
The biggest cost is actually shipping.
Yeah, sure.
And I would design a cross to fit in your standard postal service cardboard envelope. So that it would, it'll survive the shipment. But that's going to cost me like $5, $6 alone just for shipping. So that's the biggest cost is the distribution. Whereas if I'm selling them to a church and they were to say 100, well, I can put 100 in a box. It's a lot cheaper per unit to send it. So that doesn't mean I can't sell them business to customer. But it would work best then if the church essentially sold them to their customers.
Sure. Well, I think it's just about identifying those customers, right? So yours, I think, is less ambiguous. Is probably the right term. It's more about just sorting out the distribution channel. Whether it be in the beginning, Benjamin building them and shipping a few to see if there's market penetration. And then maybe the truth is you could probably go to any church of any size and they already have equipment to do those things in their hobbyists, among their hobbyists. And then that's a pathway to get it started.
I thought of that. As a matter of fact, it's like set up a weekend work project for the church. Okay, this is what we're going to do. We need laborers to handle the wood, package, stain, pack, all that kind of stuff. And that's what we're doing. I'll bring all the equipment there. We'll take over your parish hall. We'll essentially set up a manufacturing facility for a day, and we'll make these things. And it's just an idea that I think, as far as market size, there's a lot of Christians out there. and it's a real basic thing that I think most are hanging on the wall.
Right. Okay. Cool. Now listen, I've got a new meeting.
Okay,
So I have 6 minutes.
So I'll just wrap it up then. Before we end today's session, we would like to thank you guys for joining and thank you for your expertise and.
So I'll just add, if any of you at any time want to talk about your idea individually, just send me an email. We'll schedule an appointment. You sit down and talk to you. I obviously meet with tons of students, tons of people in the community all the time. Send me an email. We can sit down and work out the details on anything you want to. Because I do it all the time.
All right, thank you so much everyone for joining. I am gonna drop in a quick feedback survey. If you guys can fill that out, we'll be happy. Moving on, we'll improve the workshops that we provide for you guys. Thank you so much and have a nice day.